I can't say for certain how many days I'd been walking. The cold had a way of blurring time, of turning one endless frozen mile into the next. My feet wrapped in rags and thin leather felt like blocks of ice, and my stomach had given up its angry gnawing a long time ago, replaced by a hollow, breathless ache. The world was a vast white canvas under a sky the color of old pewter. Snow fell in a lazy, relentless hush, and the wind, a wolf at my heels, seemed determined to steal the last bit of warmth from my bones. I was a ghost, a scrap of a woman stumbling across the Montana plains, and I was sure I wouldn't make it to another sunrise. Then through the shivering haze I saw it, the silhouette of a ranch. The fences stretched out like skeletal arms, gathering a cluster of buildings against the stark white landscape. It was a promise, a last desperate hope. I forced one foot in front of the other, the sound of my ragged breathing the only thing louder than the wind. I didn't have a name anymore. Mercy Abbott was a girl I had buried a lifetime ago. I was just Eleanor Stone now, a name as plain and forgettable as the dirt I stumbled over. The only thing I had left in this world was a worn cast-iron skillet, heavy and comforting, clinking against my hip. It was all that was left of my mother, and it was the only proof I had that I had ever been loved. A man was mending a fence near the main house, his broad back to me. He was bundled in a heavy canvas coat, and a wool cap steam rising from his breath into the bitter air. When he turned, I froze. He was tall, with a strong, weary face, and eyes the color of a winter sky. For a moment, his gaze held mine, a look of profound surprise in them, as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. I knew how he felt. I felt like a mirage myself. He dropped his tools and walked toward me. I tensed, ready to bolt. Every instinct I had screamed that a man's kindness was a trap, a temporary reprieve before a different kind of pain began. But his steps were slow and steady, without a hint of threat. Up close I could see the lines etched around his eyes, the subtle curve of his mouth that spoke of a man who had known hard work and loss. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for me to smell the wood smoke on his coat. "You lost." His voice was low and quiet, like a rumble of distant thunder. I just shook my head. The word yes felt like a lie. I wasn't lost. I was simply where my broken road had ended. He nodded slowly. "You're in trouble then." It wasn't a question. He saw it all, the gaunt face, the chapped lips, the fear in my eyes that kept me from looking him in the eye for more than a second. I hesitated, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had nowhere else to go. I gave a shaky nod. He studied me for a long moment, a silence stretching between us as the snow began to fall a little harder. I knew he was weighing the risk, sizing up this wild, desperate woman who had appeared on his property like a stray dog. "What's your name?" I swallowed the act, a dry, painful scrape in my throat. "Eleanor." My fingers tightened around the handle of the skillet at my side. It felt like an anchor. I lifted my chin just a fraction of an inch and finally met his gaze. The words came out in a raspy whisper, the most truthful thing I had said in a year. "I can cook." 3 words. No story, no sob, no plea for mercy. Just the one thing I had to offer. He didn't ask for more. He just looked at the skillet, then back at me, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. He nodded, a single deliberate motion. "That's all I need." And just like that, the world shifted on its axis. He led me toward the main house, a solid presence beside me. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of burnt beans and stale coffee. The kitchen was a battlefield of unwashed pans and flour-dusted surfaces. A mountain of dishes stood precariously by the sink, a testament to a long-abandoned life of order. The last cook had quit weeks ago, leaving a vacuum of bitterness that had been filled by rough, hungry men. I looked around, my eyes taking in the chaos. I didn't know this man Jasper Cole or the men who worked for him. I didn't know their story, and they certainly didn't know mine. But in this mess, I saw a familiar landscape, a place where I had a purpose. Without a word, I rolled up my sleeves, and for the first time in what felt like 100 years, I felt a flicker of something besides fear. He watched me as I moved, silent and efficient, not asking for anything, just getting to work. I stoked the embers in the wood stove, the heat, a welcome blessing against the cold that had settled deep in my bones. I found a sack of potatoes and a forgotten ham, and began to chop, the rhythmic thud of the knife a familiar comfort. The steam from a kettle rose and warmed my face. I worked until dusk, the sense of a real meal gradually replacing the smell of neglect. By sundown, the ranch hands were drawn to the kitchen like moths to a flame, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They sat around the long wooden table, their boots crunching on the floor as they came in, their voices muted in a way I knew wasn't natural. I served them thick, rich stew, steaming bread with butter I'd made from the sour cream I found in the icebox, and a simple fruit crisp I'd put together from dried apples and a bit of sugar. They ate in a stunned silence, too hungry to talk, too surprised to complain. I stood in the corner, arms crossed over my apron, watching them. The food, a simple offering, was a bridge I had built between me and them. They didn't know my name, my past, or the storm I had just weathered. All they knew was the food on their plates, and for now I thought that might be enough. Jasper sat at the head of the table, his eyes on me, a quiet, unwavering presence. He didn't speak, but his gaze was a question. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was stand there, my shoulders a little less, hunched, my back a little straighter. The next morning I was up before the sun, as I always had been. The kitchen was still dark, but I moved through it with a quiet confidence. The sound of the first ranch hand's boots stumbling in from the cold made me pause. It was a lanky cowboy named Gus, his hair a mess, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stopped dead in the doorway, blinking at the sight of the table laden with platters of scrambled eggs and bacon, piles of fluffy biscuits, and a thick coffee that smelled like heaven. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, shaking his head. I didn't look up, just kept working, sliding a plate of food across the table. He sat down, still half asleep, and took a bite of a biscuit. His eyes widened, and he chewed slowly, a look of profound astonishment on his face. "Ma'am," he said through a mouthful, "this is mighty fine." One by one, the other hands trickled in. Silas, the broad-shouldered foreman who never smiled, grunted his approval after a bite of my eggs. Finn, the youngest, a boy who looked no older than 17, ate 3 helpings before leaning back with a sigh, his cheeks full. "Ain't had food like this since my mama's kitchen," he admitted, a quiet reverence in his voice. Jasper came in last, his hat low over his eyes. He just nodded at me and took a seat. But when he bit into one of my biscuits, I saw something in his face soften, a subtle relaxing of the lines around his eyes. It was a quiet moment, but I felt it like a warm wave. I didn't join them. I stayed by the stove, stirring a pot of hot cereal, the low hum of their conversations a comfort I hadn't known in years. They talked and laughed, their voices rough but no longer bitter. I kept my back to them, unsure if I was allowed to be a part of their world, but the sound of their easy chatter said otherwise. Jasper's voice cut through the noise, quiet but firm. "Ellie, you outdid yourself." I glanced at him just for a second, then looked away. But I didn't miss the way my shoulders relaxed a little more than they had the night before. By noon, the word had spread like wildfire. The ranch hands who had been grumbling about a new cook were now bragging about her, declaring her the best cook in all of Montana. That evening, I made a thick and hearty chicken pot pie, its golden crust a beacon of warmth against the bitter cold. The men ate with a quiet ferocity, as if they'd been starving for years. I set a tray of warm, spiced bread on the table, and Finn grabbed 2 pieces before anyone else could. "Slow down, boy," Gus laughed. "Ain't nobody going to take it from you." Finn grinned, his cheeks full. "Ain't taking no chances." The words were an inside joke, a shared moment of relief, and something inside me almost smiled. Almost. I saw Jasper watching me. He saw the faint, almost curve of my lips before I turned back to the stove. It was the first time he'd seen anything close to happiness on my face, and I knew in that moment that he saw me, really saw me. Maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to belong. The kitchen was quiet long after the men had gone to bed. I stood at the sink, scrubbing the last of the dishes, my hands red from the hot water. The work was a shield, a way to keep my mind from wandering to the icy loneliness outside, to the memories that still haunted my dreams. Jasper appeared in the doorway, a tired, thoughtful look on his face. "You don't have to do all this alone," he said, his voice a low rumble in the silence. "The boys can help." I shook my head without looking at him. "I don't mind." The lie felt comfortable. The work was my penance, my purpose. He leaned against the counter, watching me. "You ever going to sit down and eat with us?" I kept scrubbing. "I eat when I'm done." He sighed. I knew he wasn't used to a woman so stubborn, so guarded. "Suit yourself." He turned to leave, then stopped. I had reached for another dish, and my sleeve had slipped, revealing a jagged, pale scar along my wrist. I pulled my sleeve back down instantly, but not fast enough. He frowned. "You hurt yourself." I shook my head, my heart hammering. "Old burn." He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on my arm. "Let me see." I hesitated, then slowly held out my hand. The scar was old, pale, and raised, running from my wrist halfway up my forearm. It was a physical reminder of a pain that went deeper than skin. He whistled low. "That's a bad one." I pulled my hand back, a tremor in my fingers. "It doesn't hurt anymore." My voice was a brittle whisper. He studied me not with pity but with a quiet understanding that was almost worse. There was something in my voice, not pain, but a deep, unshakable sorrow. He reached into a small cupboard and pulled out a jar of salve. Here, he said, placing it on the counter between us. This will help if it ever aches. I stared at the jar, then at him, the question on my face. Why are you being kind to me? The words felt foreign, a plea I hadn't meant to make. He didn't flinch. Ain't no reason not to be. I looked away, a tear I hadn't known was coming slipping down my cheek. Most folks have reasons. He didn't have a quick answer for that. He just set the salve down on the counter and turned to leave. Well, I don't. I didn't move for a long moment, the jar a small silent promise on the counter. Then slowly I picked it up, my fingers tracing the smooth glass. Thank you, I whispered. He nodded. Get some rest, Eleanor. Tomorrow's another long day. He left me standing there holding the salve like a precious treasure. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone. The first time Mrs. Bell came to the ranch, I was kneading dough for the noon meal. The sound of a sleigh pulling up to the house made me glance out the window. A woman in a faded blue coat climbed down, followed by a boy no older than 6, his cheeks rosy from the cold, his straw-colored hair sticking out from under his cap. Jasper met them at the porch. I heard their voices muffled by the window glass. Afternoon, Mrs. Bell. Mr. Cole, the widow said with a tired smile. Brought you some eggs if you've got need of them. I watched as the boy peeked around his mother, his wide eyes landing on me in the kitchen window. He didn't look away like most people did. Instead, he grinned, showing a gap where his front tooth should be. I quickly turned back to my work, but I heard Jasper bringing them inside. Eleanor, he said, his voice a quiet warning. This is Mrs. Bell and her boy Thomas. They've got a small farm a few miles away. I nodded, but kept my hands busy with the dough. Mrs. Bell set a basket of eggs on the table. Thomas has been pestering me to see the horses, she said, her smile gentle. Hope we're not intruding. Not at all, Jasper said. Finn can show him around the barn. But Thomas didn't move. He was staring at the dough I was shaping into rolls. Mama lets me help make bread sometimes, he announced, his voice filled with an innocent longing that hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Bell flushed. Thomas, don't bother the lady. But I surprised myself by speaking. He's not bothering me. I tore off a small piece of dough and held it out. Want to try? Thomas's face lit up like a lantern. He scrambled onto a stool beside me, his little hands eagerly taking the dough. I showed him how to press and fold, my movements slow and deliberate so he could follow. Mrs. Bell's eyes softened. You're good with children. My hand stilled for just a second before I resumed working. Had practiced once, I said quietly the words, a raw, painful admission. Jasper, leaning against the doorframe, saw how carefully I guided Thomas's hands, how I didn't flinch when the boy chattered endlessly about sleigh rides and snowmen. There was a tenderness in me that I had forgotten I possessed. By the time the rolls were ready for the oven, Thomas had flour up to his elbows and a proud smile. Look, Mama, he said, holding up a lumpy, misshapen roll. I made bread. Mrs. Bell laughed, the sound bright and warm in the quiet kitchen. So you did. She touched my arm lightly. Thank you for indulging him. I only nodded, but as I watched Thomas skip out to see the horses, something ached deep in my chest. It was a ghost, a reminder of another child, another life, another time when I had felt the joy of a little hand in mine. The stranger rode in on a bay mare that looked too fine for the harsh winter landscape. I saw him first from the kitchen window, a tall man in a city suit, his gloves too clean, his hat too new. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach, turning my blood to ice. My hands froze around the bowl of flour I was holding. Out in the yard, Jasper greeted the man with the same steady courtesy he showed everyone. But when the stranger spoke, his voice carried through the biting air and the open window. Looking for a woman, the man said, his tone clipped and hard. Ran off from a good position back in Pennsylvania. Took something valuable from her employer. The bowl nearly slipped from my fingers. I could feel my body shaking. This was him, the man they had sent. I knew it. Jasper crossed his arms, his posture unyielding. Don't get many strangers through here. What's this woman look like? Brown hair, plain face, quiet type. The stranger's gaze swept over the ranch, cold and searching. She's got a particular way about her. Doesn't look folks in the eye. Got a scar on her right arm. In the kitchen, my breath came too fast. I touched the scar on my wrist, the one from a stove at Hartwell House where I'd worked before everything went wrong. Jasper's voice was calm, his tone giving nothing away. Can't say I've seen anyone like that. What did she steal? The stranger hesitated for a moment. Family heirloom. Silver locket. A lie. My fingers crept to the pocket of my apron where the folded letter rested. The only thing I had taken. The one with my baby's name written in shaky ink, the one they had said I had no right to keep. Out in the yard, the stranger was growing impatient. I'll pay good money for information. She's likely using a different name. Jasper shook his head, his face a mask of indifference. Sorry, mister. Can't help you. The man studied Jasper for a moment longer, then tipped his hat. If you hear anything, I'm at the boarding house in town. He rode off, leaving the taste of his cruelty hanging in the cold air. I didn't realize I was shaking until Jasper walked into the kitchen and gently took the bowl from my hands. You don't have to run, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on mine. Not from me. I stared at him, my throat tight, a sob caught in my chest. He'll come back. Let him. Jasper's voice was steady, a promise as solid as the ground beneath my feet. This ranch has plenty of rifles, and I know how to use them. I wrapped my arms around myself, a fresh wave of terror washing over me. You don't even know what I did. I know enough, he said, his gaze unwavering. I know you're running from something bad. I know you're scared. And I know that man out there thinks he owns people, and I don't hold with that. A sob broke free from my throat. I turned away, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. He didn't touch me. He just stood there, a quiet, protective presence, as solid as an oak tree in a storm. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, deliberate normality. Supper still needs making. You want me to send one of the boys to help? It was such an ordinary question, so out of place in the storm of emotion that I almost laughed through the tears. I wiped my face with my apron. Number, I can do it. He nodded. Then I'll leave you to it. As he walked out, I realized something. For the first time since I'd arrived, the thought of leaving hadn't crossed my mind, and that scared me almost as much as the stranger had. A hard winter storm kept everyone indoors that evening. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and the snow fell in a thick, unrelenting curtain. The ranch hands gathered around the fireplace in the main room, mending tack and telling stories in low voices. I worked quietly in the kitchen, the steady rhythm of my knife chopping vegetables blending with the patter of sleet on the roof. Jasper appeared in the doorway, an old ledger book under his arm. Mind if I work in here? The stove's warmer than the office. I nodded toward the table. He settled into a chair, spreading out his papers. For a long while, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the wind, and the scratch of his pen. Then my knife slipped. A sharp gasp escaped me as the blade nicked my finger. Jasper was at my side in an instant, his hands reaching for mine. It's nothing, I said, but he had already pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket. Even small cuts can hurt, he said, his voice surprisingly tender as he wrapped the cloth gently around my finger. His hands were rough from ranch work, but his touch was so careful, so unexpectedly gentle, that my throat tightened with a strange mix of emotions. Without meaning to, I whispered, "You're the first person in a long time who's been kind without wanting something in return." He stilled, then he released my hand and walked to a cupboard. He returned with a small wooden box and placed it on the table between us. "I keep this in my desk," he said, his voice softer now. "Never showed it to anyone." I hesitated, my heart thumping. He nodded, a quiet permission. I lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded letter, its edges soft from years of handling. I glanced at him and he just nodded again. The handwriting was strong and clear, but the ink was smudged in places as if, God, the letter began. "It's been a year today since Sarah left this earth. I don't know why you took her when that no-account doctor said it was just a fever. I don't know why you left me here alone. But if you can hear me, tell her I kept my promise. The ranch is still standing. I'm still standing most days. Anyway," my hands trembled as I carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the box. When I looked up, Jasper's eyes were bright with unshed tears. In that moment, something inside me broke. Seeing his raw, honest grief, I knew I wasn't alone with my pain. I told him. The words came slowly at first, then faster, a torrent of a story I had never dared to speak. I told him about the baby boy who had come too early and lived only hours. About the husband who had blamed me before disappearing into a whiskey bottle. About the wealthy family I'd worked for who had treated me like property. The locket that man was looking for. I swallowed hard. It had my baby's name inside. They said it belonged to the family because I was their servant, but it was all I had left of him. Jasper listened without interrupting. When my voice finally broke, he didn't offer empty comforts. He just reached across the table and covered my hand with his. The storm drummed on outside. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. I realized I was crying, great heaving sobs that shook my whole body. He didn't shy away. He just waited, his hand warm and steady on mine until the storm inside me passed. When I finally caught my breath, he spoke softly. We've both been living with ghosts, haven't we? I looked at our joined hands, then at the letter in the box. 2 broken people, 2 stories of loss. But in this moment, we weren't alone anymore. The whole valley buzzed with excitement for the winter community meal. Folks came from miles around bringing dishes to share, and children who darted between the tables set up in Jasper's big barn. I had been cooking for days. Pies and breads, roasted meats, vegetables from the root cellar glazed with honey. Now I stood by the kitchen door, watching as neighbors filled their plates, their laughter ringing through the rafters. Mrs. Bell approached with Thomas, who proudly held up a crooked little cake. I made it myself. I bent to examine it. That's fine baking, Thomas. The widow touched my arm. He hasn't stopped talking about you since you showed him how to knead dough. You've been very good for him. Her eyes said what her words didn't, that Thomas had needed kindness since his father passed. Before I could respond, a commotion rose near the barn doors. A group of children had surrounded Finn, begging for a sleigh ride. The young cowboy looked panicked until I appeared with a tray of spiced cookies. Anyone who wants a ride has to eat first, I announced. The children descended on the treats with glee. Finn shot me a grateful look. You always know what folks need before they do. As the afternoon wore on, I moved through the crowd, refilling drinks, passing out clean napkins, gently steering a toddler away from the cider barrel. I didn't realize Jasper had been watching me until he stepped up beside me near the pie table. Notice something, he asked. I followed his gaze. Mrs. Bell was chatting with Silas near the punch bowl. Wyatt, the new hand, was arm wrestling one of the neighboring ranchers to cheers from the crowd. Even the grumpiest of the ranch hands were smiling. Everyone's. I struggled to find the word. Together, he finished. Like a real community. And it started in your kitchen. I shook my head. I just cooked some food. He turned to face me fully. Ellie, look around. That little girl. He pointed to a child feeding cookie crumbs to a barn cat. Her mama told me she hadn't spoken since her brother died until she tried your gingerbread. He nodded toward an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie. The Millers haven't left their farm in years. Came special today because they heard about your cooking. My face grew warm. That's not me. That's just people being people. Jasper's voice softened and he took my hand. That's just what I'm saying. You brought people together without even trying. Ellie, you're not just our cook. You're our heart. The words settled over me like sunlight. For the first time in my wandering life, I wasn't just passing through. I was part of something. I was home. And when Thomas came running up to drag me into the barn dance, I went willingly, letting the music and laughter carry me along. Across the room, Jasper watched me smile, really smile, and I knew Winspur Ranch would never be the same. Neither would he. Winter came softly, dusting the plains in a thin, glittering frost that turned everything into a landscape of breathtaking beauty. I stood at the kitchen window, watching my breath fog the glass as I waited for the coffee to brew. The cast-iron skillet, my mother's skillet, sat on the stove, well-seasoned and warm from use. I thought about how different my life was now. The kitchen that had once felt like a borrowed space was truly mine. The ranch hands who had been strangers now tipped their hats and called me Miss Ellie with genuine affection. And Jasper. The back door creaked open, letting in a rush of cold air. Jasper stomped his boots, clean, his cheeks red from the morning chill. Got the north fence repaired before breakfast, he announced, rubbing his hands together near the stove. I poured him a steaming mug without being asked. You'll freeze out there without proper gloves. He wrapped his fingers around the warm cup, smiling. Got too much to do to worry about cold hands. We fell into our usual comfortable silence as I cracked eggs into the skillet. The sizzle filled the kitchen, mingling with the scent of strong coffee and wood smoke. Then Jasper spoke, his voice low and serious. Ellie. Something in his voice made me turn. He wasn't looking at me but at the skillet on the stove. You remember what you said when you first came here? I did, of course. Those 3 words that had changed everything. I can cook. He set down his cup and reached into his pocket. When he opened his hand, a simple ring lay in his palm. A band of polished silver, unadorned but gleaming in the morning light. I never asked where you'd been, he said quietly, his gaze meeting mine. I only knew what you brought when you came. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The eggs were forgotten. I stared at the ring, then at Jasper's face, the lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the quiet steadiness in his gaze. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't make grand promises. He just held out the ring and said, "That's all I need if you'll have me." Outside, a winter bird sang. The coffee pot bubbled softly. I looked around the kitchen at the shelves. I'd organized the herbs drying by the window, the dented tin cup he always used. I thought of the ranch hands who had become family, of Thomas's laughter, of the way this place had slowly pieced my broken heart back together. I didn't speak. Words had never been my strength. Instead, I reached out and took his hand, letting my fingers curl around his rough ones. And that was all he needed. The spring wedding was simple, just as we wanted. The ranch hands wore their best shirts. Thomas carried the rings on a pillow, and Mrs. Bell cried into her handkerchief. I wore a dress the color of sagebrush, and Jasper's hands shook when he slid the silver band onto my finger. Afterward, the whole valley came to celebrate. There was music and dancing and so much food that even Silas had to loosen his belt. As the sun set behind the mountains, I stood on the porch with my husband, watching our friends and neighbors laugh together under the lantern light. He squeezed my hand, and I leaned into his side, watching Thomas teach an off-kilter waltz while the widow clapped along. I thought of the kitchen waiting for me, of the garden they'd plant in the morning, of the life we'd build together. I didn't say anything, just smiled. And that was all he needed. Life often teaches us that healing does not come through grand gestures, but through simple acts of kindness and steady presence. Eleanor arrived at Jasper's ranch with nothing but a skillet and 3 words: "I can cook." From that small offering, a whole new life began. For those of us who have walked through loss, grief, or long loneliness, her story is a reminder that even when we feel stripped of everything, we still carry something of value inside us. Sometimes it is a skill, sometimes a memory, and sometimes simply the will to keep moving forward. Jasper's response, "That's all I need," shows the quiet power of acceptance. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't judge her past. He simply made room for her gift. That is a lesson we can all carry, to see people not for what they have lost, but for what they still have to give. For older generations especially, this truth is comforting. Life may leave scars, but it also leaves wisdom, resilience, and the capacity to nurture others. In the end, it is not perfection or wealth that brings us together. It is kindness, community, and the courage to keep offering what little we have. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.